Hello and welcome to Guy Logic. My name is Temko and today we are taking a look at a game called Ashes of the Singularity. It's been in early access for quite a while and it is now fully released for version 1.0, so we're gonna take to it and give you our impressions. The game is developed by Oxide Games as well as Stardock Entertainment and published by Stardock Entertainment. And if you've never heard of Oxide Games, that is fine, neither have I. But we all know Stardock Entertainment. They have been in this for a while, being developers of Sins of a Solar Empire, among other things. Now, what is Ashes of the Singularity? Well, Ashes of the Singularity is basically trying to be Supreme Commander. It's large-scale battles, it's robot combat, it's building your empire, it's an RTS. But unlike StarCraft 2, for example, which really focuses on individual units, this game focuses about armies, army compositions, and large-scale combat. So if we're going to first take a look at the options menu, explain how that goes, how the performance is, and all the good stuff there. Then we're gonna go ahead and dive into a skirmish match with the AI and talk a little bit about the multiplayer aspect of the game and how we feel the game will fare forward. So without any further ado, let's head on in the options menu. If you do not want to hear and see me talk about options for the next 5 or so minutes, I suggest you press the annotation that has appeared somewhere on screen and skip on straight ahead. But I do suggest you walk with us because performance is a bit of an important part of this game if you want to run it at a high frame rate as well as having hundreds to thousands of units displayed on screen at any time. So, options. The options menu is mostly okay and it has some options. Now, if you're coming from StarCraft, you'll be pretty disappointed by the options menu. Mostly because StarCraft has so many options to customize your experience that this game does not yet have. They do have a roadmap with some additional things for customization coming in, but obviously not in right now, so we're not reviewing that, we're reviewing it as it is. So, the game options menu has binding the cursor, which is binding it to a window, which is really good. I'm not sure why you would not want that bound to window on an RTS, that seems a bit ridiculous. You can have whatever icon you want. It's a bit of a fiddly thing, but doesn't matter. And panning and camera controls, 2 options here as well, which is pretty good. Which means that you pan with the right mouse button and rotate with the middle mouse button, which is pretty much okay. Now, you can skip intro movies, display health unit bars. I'm going to turn this on. And engineers will require an actual stop command before stopping anything, as opposed to redirecting a command for them. So this is pretty useful if you're trying to do many things at once and you want your engineers to go forward. Obviously, if you mess up and you give an engineer the wrong command, you will lose actions to correct that more so than you would otherwise. So this is a preference thing. And then you have the interface scale and all that stuff. Video options are pretty complete. Now, it is important to note that this game runs on a special kind of engine that is really designed to introduce multi-core AI to the system, allowing for very large-scale computational AI, which apparently gives a much better impression when you're fighting AI instead of using a cheating AI or things like that other RTSs often do. Now, I can't really attest whether or not this is a really good AI, but it is pretty decent. It has given me quite a run for my money. I mean, obviously, it will never compare to the best of players, but if you are a casual player, the AI in this game is actually pretty decent and it does not cheat. So you can really much, strategize and practice against it if you're pretty new. So that's pretty good. Now, performance-wise, the video options are great. The game even runs on DX12 if you have Windows 10, so that is also really good. But the game's performance is not that great. For example, running a 500 unit battle with all the particles and all the units and all the movement and all the calculations will tank frame rate to below 30 for me. It's an RTS, it's not that important, I say with a caveat, because RTSs are notoriously heavy-handed on the APM department, with StarCraft leading the way with 300-400 APM being necessary, and having frame drops or lag is killer for that. It's not viable. While the developers have definitely worked really hard to improving performance, it's not there yet. Now, if you have a beastie machine and you're running a 980 Ti or some similar card to that, you will have many fewer issues. But even then, having huge multiplayer, many people battles with many units in there, hundreds of individual units, it will still tank your frame rate. Now, this was an issue that Supreme Commander also had. This was an issue that Total Annihilation still has. We're talking about a game from over 20 years ago. So this is not a new issue. It is simply inherent on the fact that you're rendering hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of units on screen, and they have to use all these computations to get their simulations running for combat. So if you want to avoid that, you're going to have to lower your settings. If you do not want to avoid that and you're okay with having a little bit of less frame rate, then you can keep them up. I've put them somewhere around to mid to high range on my side. I've changed some a bit lower to help me out in this, but even then I drop below 60. I do only have a GTX 780, so it is not the newest or latest of cards, and your mileage may vary. Audio options are okay. You can mute audio, not sure why, but they are okay. There's nothing special to these audio options, and it doesn't have any fancy bells or whistles. It simply is. Pretty good. One caveat for audio options, but that's most of a personal pet peeve. When you alt-tab, the audio keeps playing, and there's no way to turn that off. But even worse than all of that audio nonsense, the game does not have rebindable keys. There is a key display when you log in, but it is set in stone and you cannot change any of the hotkeys in the entire game. For an RTS, that is fundamentally unacceptable, and for me personally, might actually be a reason not to buy a game. There's great things about this game, but that is definitely not one of them. That is the options menu. It is decent, but the game does have some performance issues. We are going to skip the benchmarking tool because there is some issues with recording the benchmark. I tried it a couple of times, and I just couldn't get a good read on the benchmark while recording, so you might have somebody else that has had better luck recording that. Okay, the game has 3 game modes. It has Ascendancy Wars, which is sort of a campaign. It has Skirmishes, which is versus AI. And it has Multiplayer, which is again versus friends or ranked. I'm going to show you that. Ranked games, custom matches, and you can also check rankings. So the game has a pretty big suite of content you can play with in the game. The Ascendancy Wars are going to be released episodically. I'm going to assume they're going to be released as DLC later down the line with various updates. And the missions inside of at least the very first episode, you can at least see them here, episode 1, Imminent Crisis, are okay. They're a great introduction and a good tutorial. Now the game has a tutorial, so you don't need these for a tutorial. But the game has these episodes, and this first episode starts you off as if you were in a tutorial. The first mission, you only have a few units. The second mission, you get a few more units, and it has a pretty funny, interesting, cool story. Gives you a little bit of the lore and story behind the Ashes of Singularity world. So that is pretty cool. But what we're going to do is we are going to dive into a skirmish match, and we are going to talk about AI, multiplayer combat, development trees, all the good stuff. Let's get into it, shall we? So skirmishing has you up to 6 players. You, an AI, and up to 4 more. So 6 players totals. And each of these has a very large variety of maps. And I mean, I'm not joking, it has so many maps. It has 3-player maps, 6-player maps, 2-player maps, 4-player maps. I'm not sure it has a 5-player map, that'd be pretty interesting. But it has quite a few maps. They're all diverse, and they are all pretty unique. There is very few variants of the map, even if the icon looks a little bit the same, that play the same. Different maps have different tactics, and I really enjoy the map aesthetic and map building they've introduced in this game. I'll get into that when we dive into the game. So there is definitely thought put into skirmishes, and the same thought and effort has been put into the online multiplayer. Map selection, whether or not you have hidden terrain, whether or not there's natural defenders. These are AI defenders that are not based on a faction. Having these on will mean you need an army to capture the various points on the map. And if these are off, then you can start capturing it using engineers or something like that. And then you have the victory points you need to win. So the game has a couple of different victory conditions. One is destroying the enemy nexus, which is their main starting building, much like the commander was in Supreme Commander or Total Annihilation. The other way is to capture these various points on the map that will generate a resource, and once you reach a maximum amount of that resource, whoever gets there first wins. And both these conditions are in the game at any time. So if somebody's, and I like this system, and I'll get into that in a little bit when we are in the game and explain why I like this system so much, because one of the main issues I had regarding the game with Supreme Commander. So what we're going to do is we're going to do a normal AI, because I am still pretty bad at this game and I'm learning all the mechanics. And we're going to change the PHC, Post-Human Coalition Race, because this is the race I've been playing most with. There's 2 races in the game. There is going to be a third one, but when is still the question. Okay, so 2 races. They are slight differences between them, but they are more or less the same in terms of the kind of units they deploy. Now, there is some differences in the way they deploy these units and the way they interact with these things, and I'll get into that in a little bit again. First, we're going to start with the teams. There's 2 teams. We're going to start at one of our locations. We're going to pick random because that seems fair, and going to select our colors. There you go. That is really it. Okay, we're going to do a 1v1 on a 4-player map, so that should be interesting. And we're going to go ahead and start the game with natural defenses on and terrain hidden on this BIS map. Actually, let's change the map to Avon. Crater? No. Frozen Wastes. Seems reasonable. This seems like a reasonably fun map to do it soon. Okay, let's get into it, shall we? Okay, once you load into a game, you start with a Nexus, an Engineer, and you start in one of these Nexi points with these lines moving out of your Nexus. Now, these lines are pretty important because they decide the flow of the battle, and I'll get into all of that in a second. The most important thing to know about Ashes of Singularity compared to games like StarCraft is that it uses a streaming resource system, which means that resources keep streaming in, but you have a very limited capacity of storing these resources compared to games like StarCraft, where you bundle up resources and then spend them in one chunk. So if you buy something that's 100 metal, you don't instantly spend 100 metal. No, the game says, well, you're going to spend 100 metal over the next 20 seconds. So it is less about having enough resources. It is more about having the necessary flow of resources to keep up production. And this is important because the game is all about keeping up production and then expanding on that and keeping up that new tier of production. Compared to StarCraft, where you build a unit, build a unit, build a unit, and you may stop building a certain unit because you have 4 or 5 of them. This game really doesn't allow for that kind of gameplay because you need armies, because they're throwaway. You'll throw armies and armies and armies one after the other, and they will die. So you're going to use those armies to refresh new armies, and your goal is to have the best trades possible compared to your opponent, and eventually push them back into their main base, or hopefully win by using Terranium. So what is Terranium? If you look at the screen, on the top of the screen there are these 4 icons, and depending on the map, they could be 2, there could be 6, there could be 20 if somebody builds a map with that many Terranium nodes. Terranium nodes are much like every other node. You can see me building something on screen on all these nodes, but they generate Terranium. They generate this for the player that holds the most of these nodes. If all players hold an equal amount of nodes, well, it doesn't generate any extra Terranium for anyone. So you need a superior number of nodes to generate Terranium. Once you reach the maximum capacity of Terranium, the game ends, you will have won. This is a very interesting tactic and something Supreme Commander had a lot of problems with in regards to people just turtling up, building defenses and not moving and stretching games out for hours. This game does not really allow for that because the other players will just take all the Terranium reactors and wait for a few minutes until they win. You have to move out, you have to keep your armies moving, and you have to keep skirmishing over all these points of control. So, what are these points of control and what do they do? Well, as you just saw, my engineer is building on these little node points. The only way you get resources is if you have an extractor on these nodes. You have metal and radioactives as your 2 main resources. You build these on these nodes and they generate your resources, but you also have to control the node itself. You do so by having units near it, as the only player there, and if an enemy controls them and you kill his units, you can take over their nodes. It's vitally important that these nodes have a direct line of control to your main base. So if there's 3 nodes in a line and you only control the first and third, your main base will not get any benefits of the 3rd node. But if you control the 2nd node, you will get the benefits of all 3 nodes. That is really important because that's a major part of tactical gameplay, is deciding which nodes you can defend and which nodes are important for you to keep your flow of resources coming in. Because resources generated by a node, even though you have buildings there to generate those resources, will not actually get you resources, so they're kind of useless. Now, that is the resource system. How does that translate into armies and combat? You build a factory, it spews out units, and there's 3 tiers of units. You'll see them all in this match I'm displaying right here. There's a couple of different units. There's obviously your general tank, your scout, your artillery tank, your medic unit, etc. These are all here. You have some sniper units, you have some AoE attack units, Basically, the entire gamut of RTS units is here, and each fill a niche or role within your army. Now, I'm going to keep bringing up the comparison to StarCraft because the game is fundamentally different from StarCraft in many regards. And if you guys remember Total Annihilation or Supreme Commander, it was less about having a specific unit or two of a specific unit. It was more about your overall composition compared to your enemies. If your enemy was going very heavy on aircraft, you would probably add in a bunch more anti-air units in your army composition. If your enemy was not building any aircraft, you wouldn't build any anti-air. Pretty logical, right? But the difference here is that you can mix and match to a very large army. So it's not about having, oh, I need 5 of this to counter his 7 of that. No, it's, do I need a continuous production of anti-air units to make sure every army I compose has at least enough anti-air to ward off the enemies? So it's all about bigger scale numbers. You can see on the screen, my units are fighting a little bit here and there. I'm building some buildings, I'm building some point defenses. All of that is in the game. But the main crux is composing an army with enough of a variety of units that your enemy cannot just throw sniper units against them, cannot just throw artillery on them, or can't just fly over with one type of unit and destroy them. You need a solid composition based on what you know your enemy has. And you need to scout and figure out. Once you have an army, what do? Well, you expand. As I said earlier, you need to control these points to get resources. You need resources to build more armies, so it's really a game about controlling the most resource points. You're gonna have lots of roaming armies, or you may have one big army based on your gameplay and style, but you need to take over all these points. You can see my units moving around and capturing all these little points on the map, which will allow me to bridge to the next point and get more and more resources flowing and going. It is also very important because obviously one of the win conditions I already explained is Terrenium. It also needs a direct path of control to your main base. So if you only control a few nodes between your main nexus and the enemy's nexus, or your main nexus and the Terrenium nexus, you won't actually get any Terrenium benefits. You may control the node, but you do not control the roadways between those various nodes, so you will not get any of those benefits. And the game is all about this entire map of warfare where you have to use the entire map. And I really love this system. It forces people from turtling, it forces diversification, it forces you to be attentive for various aspects of the map, it forces you to make decisions based on which nodes you will defend, where you will put resources into static defense, where you will put resources into expanding your node to get better production. There's a building to increase the output of each node you capture. You're going to have to make all these decisions based on where you think your enemy is going to attack, what kind of composition your enemy has, and even if he can or can't attack that specific node at that time. It is really, really cool how this multi-tiered, multi-pronged combat evolves. One of the main things with Supreme Commander, and also one of the main things with StarCraft, is that combat often devolves into a big battle, one big fight that decides the outcome. And that big fight might be won or lost by either side, but it's often just one big fight, and from there you can basically predict the outcome, provided either one of the opponents doesn't make a huge mess up. In this game though, because the entire map is the battlefield, and you have to use the entire map and all the resource points on the map, an enemy that is stretched too thin to capture all these resources may be vulnerable for a big attack down the middle into his main nexus. But an enemy that is turtling slowly may get overwhelmed by increasingly large numbers of production units because his income is so low. It's a continuous fight for balance between expanding, maintaining, and exploiting all the various nodes. Phenomenal. I really applaud the developers for this mechanic. Okay, talking about armies, talking about army compositions and combat. How does the game handle that? Well, here is a bit of a minor disappointment to me personally, but I understand it from a gameplay perspective and from a developer perspective. There's currently 2 factions in the game, and while the developers have tried to make them feel different from one or the other, they have run into the same problems many other RTSs have, that the changes they implement between the various races obviously add a layer of complexity in terms of balance. This is one of the major banes for StarCraft 2, with its very diverse races that are very, very different in game style, unit composition, build, where if you balance one unit to another unit, for example, you balance Marines to be good versus Mutalisks if you're thinking StarCraft 2, then suddenly your Mutalisks are amazing against Zealots because they can somehow get that damage down. And you want to avoid these vicious circles of development cycles where you have to balance and rebalance because the previous balance wasn't that good. So what you end up with is very similar races. What you end up with is things that Supreme Commander had. Yes, there were some minor differences between the guys using machine guns and the guys using lasers, but they were minor and only really relevant at the highest levels of competitive play, where certain decisions were based on what the enemy could or couldn't do. In this game, that too is the case. Yes, there is definitely a difference between the two and eventually 3 races that are going to be implemented, but they are mostly in which unit is used when, and not the kind of base gameplay changes you implement. There is no such major difference, such as pylons for a Protoss or creep for the Zerg. You still expand the same way, you still capture the same way, you still use engineers, you still have 2 or 3 tiers of units. And while there are some differences where the kind of units you use, for example, the other race doesn't have a tier 1 scout unit, and this race does, and there are some differences, but they're minor, and while they do matter a little bit in gameplay, they're not fundamental. So that is, I feel, a bit of a shame, but we can't really fault the developers for choosing a little bit safer route that more or less gives them a better way to balance the various gameplay modes, especially for competitive play. Now, if you can see my minimap, you'll see I'm not scouting at all this match. And that is obviously horrible, because I have no idea what my opponent is doing. Now, because I'm fighting an AI, I know the opponent more or less won't do much of consequence. But in a normal map, you will have built an air factory, sent out some aircraft, built some scouts, flown around and seen what your opponent is up to. Is he taking the Terrenium? Is he forcing expansion? Is he building a big army to push down the middle? I don't know right now. Obviously, that, if I was playing a human, would be a fatal flaw. How do you get information? How do you scout? Again, this game has thought of that. It hasn't thought of it in every sense of the way, because there is some things where I'm like, they could have thought of it a little bit better on that, and they could provide better information on that. But here's how you do it. First, obviously, you have line of sight. If you can see it, you know what it's up to. Second, you have radar. Each unit has an attack and detection radius. These are generally one and the same for most units. But certain units have a much longer attack radius than they have a vision radius, such as artillery units. In these situations, you need radar. Radar can be done in either units with radar, and these are things like scout units or big capital ships, or you build listening posts that provide a radar around an area. The way radar works, it works more like a heat map. It displays a heat in different gradients of color on the map, and you can basically sort of guesstimate, is it a small army, is it a big army, is it a large spread out army, but you don't have all the information. You don't see, oh, well, there's 20 units here and they have artillery there. No, you only see a big blob of heat moving forward, and it's up to you to get visual confirmation on their capacity for that army. A really cool system. Now, having spoken about army composition, army building, resource management, expansion, that directly translates to how you win a battle. Either you get Terrenium, or you destroy your enemy's nexus. You do so obviously by defeating them in battle time and time again until they do not have the army to resist your continued advances. This means that matches in Ashes of Singularity can drag on a bit longer. Now, if you're facing AI, you can press below the top right side of the UI. There is a plus and minus sign with a normal behind it right now. You can press that and go faster to make simulation time speed up. This does impact performance some, so it's a trade-off whether or not you want to do that. I haven't done this for this match, and this AI match took me about 35 minutes to complete. Now, it is also important to note that until the enemy nexus is destroyed or you have maximum Terrenium, the game will go on as usual. But you cannot move your nexus, you cannot change its location, and this is very important, if your enemy takes the Terrenium, they will have that Terrenium for later on, even if you capture that a little bit later. So it's not like you're taking their Terrenium away from them. You both have your own counters, how much you've harvested, and if you get fewer reacts than your opponent, your count stops, there starts again. But if you get back your count, you start off where you left off. So it's a game of cat and mouse, a game of tug, more or less, where you are trying to get a little bit of a advantage here and there, a little bit of resource, a better engagement, less damage taken, a few more units saved, maybe you've got an upgrade or two. Now, upgrading in this game, again, streaming economy works on basis of a streaming economy. Now, there's not a great deal of upgrades if you think about upgrades in the terms of the way StarCraft does it. You don't get upgrades where suddenly your stalkers have blink. Something like that doesn't really happen. You have simpler upgrades here because it's all about the big army compositions. and less about the micromanagement of individual units. There is some of that, but not a lot. So how upgrades work is you build a quantum generating node. This node then generates a resource which allows you to initiate upgrades. Now, these resources are used for two things: upgrades and special powers. These powers are unlocked as you build buildings to create these powers. And these powers are everything from an orbital bombardment to getting a unit drop somewhere on the map, to getting extra engineers, to radar scans, to instant repairs. So using these effectively is very important. But because you have to get a building to get them, and these are the orbitals buildings, it takes resources. And you may not have those resources for all those buildings. So again, it's a balance of how much resources can I spend, how much am I getting in, and how much time do I have to build up these various nodes. Now, as for generic upgrades, there is two that are of vital importance. One is the upgrade for your logistics capacity, which basically translates to how big can my armies get. And you need to do these several times, and each time they get more and more expensive. And the second type of upgrade is upgrading your storage capacity for these various nodes. So, as I said earlier, your storage capacity is very tiny, and you really work on maximizing your streaming economy. This doesn't mean you can't abuse the little bit of storage you have. Each factory has a production method where you can pause production, which means a unit in building is paused during building. Obviously very cool, because you can start building a capital class ship, a dreadnought, see your resource storage for like metal or radioactives plummet because your increased usage is much bigger than your increased income. You get it to like a half or a third built, you pause building and wait for your storage to fill up again. That way you don't restock your other facilities where you're building secondary buildings or units. A very cool system that is going to be vitally important at competitive levels, where you can mix and manage the most out of your income, because you can definitely spend more than you're getting in, but you need to have storages for that. So it's a really cool system to get a little bit of a boost out of that. Now, very important to note, one last thing about resources: if you have no more storage left and you're in the negatives in consumption, resource production isn't stopped, but is drastically reduced as resources become available for various projects. It means that resource build times are increased a great number of times over. The last thing I want to mention regarding resource production and resource generation is that unlike Total Annihilation, unlike Planetary Annihilation, and unlike Supreme Commander, Ashes of the Singularity does not have a harvesting mechanic where you recover some resources from wrecks of destroyed units. There is no such thing in the game. Destroyed units disappear magically from the battlefield and do not count any longer. There is a note in the roadmap that they are going to add such a thing, but that is definitely not in right now. So I feel this is definitely a negative towards the harvesting a resource system, because that allows for a very smart player to, even with a limited set of nodes under his control, to still gain a traction and footing by smartly defending and controlling who harvests the remaining resources after a big battle, getting a boost and an injection of resources into his units that they would not have otherwise because they don't control those nodes. So I feel this is definitely the last part over an overall great system, but this last little bit is definitely somewhat lacking. Okay, now I've spoken about basically all things related to the army, the building, the composition, and everything around that. I've also spoken about how long the battles are going to take. What I've not spoken about is the issues I have with army composition, army building, and control. Now, the game isn't about micromanagement, so it's not unexpected that units feel less responsive than they do in games like StarCraft 2. But the units feel enormously unresponsive. If you tell units to move away, they will only move away very slowly. You can't really tell them to flee or rout if you see that they're going to get butchered if they don't. They will still act very slow movement while fighting the enemy, even if they're hopelessly outnumbered. It's also important to note that it is very difficult to split off a chunk of your army to focus it on one or the other side, in case you want to focus a capital ship while still pushing away or at least delaying a large chunk of enemies from a different angle. Because your units are structured into armies by you, every unit you control controls that entire army. You lose individual control over units at that point. Now you can disband these armies and then reband them as you want, but it's a very fiddly process. And while the idea of these armies as a cohesive whole is very interesting, and it really saves on the micromanagement, because you might have 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 of these armies in various control groups running around the map, trying to control points, trying to retake points, trying to remove or skirmish with the enemy, it is very fiddly to keep control over them using your army command. Even if you group them together, let's say you group one half of an army in one control group with control 1 or control 2, and you group a different part of the army in a different control group, you still don't have that fine-tuned control, and that is, in my opinion, a big problem. This is especially important when you're fighting with big units such as capital class destroyers. These units are very expensive. They have a leveling mechanic where they upgrade themselves, and you want to save these units as much as possible. But you can't when you are faced with a bunch of things that your unit just doesn't want to move away. And your repair units, if you directly give them a command to go repair that capital ship, they react very slowly. So the actual fine-tuned control is very lacking in my opinion. Now, if you're interested in big controls with big armies, then it doesn't really matter. But you want to have that fine-tuned control nonetheless. When you are in a big battle, maybe you are in a very even battle, getting those tiny little nudges of advantage may make or break your battle, or even your entire match, based on how well you execute them. And the fact that you don't have that fine-tuned control is a real shame. Okay, having spoken all of that, how is the unit variety, how is your tactical variety, and what can you look forward to if you are going into multiplayer? Does the game have a chance of having a vibrant online community? Well, I think this game has a much bigger chance than the homeworld game I reviewed a couple of months ago did. For one thing, it has mod support. And this is very important because that means players can make their own maps if they so desire, and they can also have various modding things in place, maybe even different game modes. Obviously, one of the main things on StarCraft that Blizzard is giving away for free is the StarCraft Arcade, with a variety of horde maps and game modes and story modes and a bunch of things that allow you to make or play your game even if you're not playing the actual multiplayer matches. The second thing is that the map matchmaking is pretty good. It tries to match you to decent players. There's not a large waiting times, so you get a game pretty fast, and the games are generally well played out. You get a good gameplay section in. One of the things I am worried about is that unlike StarCraft, whose matches are usually 15 to 20 minutes long, this game's matches will probably last somewhere in the vicinity of 35 to 40 minutes on average, from my own experience. I may be very wrong, maybe I'm playing the game completely wrong, and matches could last 10 minutes, but as it stands, the matches last a little bit longer. One thing that I am definitely worried about is the unit variety. Currently, there is right about 15 different combat units in the game for either faction. This means that regardless of the type of combat you're doing, you'll always be using all the units. There's only one light tank, there's only one bomber aircraft, there's only one area control carrier, there's only one support cruiser, etc, etc. These units have a good composition because you need all of them, but you need all of them. There is very little variety in choice you make regarding whether or not you want to go a certain game plat or certain game style. Your only choice are really whether or not you want to focus heavily on air or not so heavily on air. But you will probably need to do that regardless. You need to build a variety of all units. Now, there's something to be said of not having any wasteful units, but even so, it feels like a little bit like they've added the bare minimum of units they need to flesh out their title and stopped at that. I'm not sure I like this because I'm one of those guys that likes experimenting with things. I like a variety of different ways I can play the game. I like a variety of different tactics and unit compositions I need to create out of different units. Whether I'm going with Marines and tanks in StarCraft, or I'm going with mech, or I'm going with Ling Muta, or I'm going with Roach Hydra. These are different game styles with different units in play. This game doesn't really have that. It basically tells you build all units and compose them as you wish. If you want to build a heavy army style, you can focus a little bit more on getting some dreadnoughts out. And if you want air combat, well, you're going to focus on a little bit on aircraft. But if you want good anti-air defense, you're building air-to-air fighters. Ground units are not going to provide the necessary air defense if the enemy has a strong enough air force. So that is, I feel, a bit of a shame. Now, obviously, I'm not sure how much modding can impact this and how many changes the modding community is going to introduce to this, but this will be something, at least for the competitive aspect of the ranked mode, something to keep in mind. And again, this does translate to easier to balance, more controlled gameplay, which should, in theory, benefit the online competitive scene. Okay, what else is there to do in the game in regards to expanding, exploring, destroying things, building things, etc. Units have two types of combat styles, you could call them. You can either have a unit run around and do its thing with its army, or you can make them part of a dreadnought group. Now, in theory, these actions are the same. The main difference is that armies are composed around different types of units. If you have a bunch of small tanks and you build them around a dreadnought, they will provide a meat shield for that dreadnought. If you surround them with a support carrier, a support dreadnought, they will try to support the dreadnought from different angles. So your composition changes based on the kind of dreadnought you have. If you have multiple dreadnoughts, your armies will split themselves in between those 3 dreadnoughts, or 4 dreadnoughts, or 5 dreadnoughts. And each army will try to assign the necessary units as best it can, based on what the game thinks the composition should be, to those dreadnoughts. Meaning that each dreadnought has sort of their own escort, which is a really cool way to do it. Now, as I said earlier, dreadnoughts have a leveling mechanic. This means that once a dreadnought has enough experience, and this is during combat, when it kills enemies and does things like that, it unlocks certain upgrades. These upgrades are passive, like repair the dreadnought. These upgrades are active, like a drone army, where you can send out little combat drones, or a short-range AoE blast that kills lots of things in its vicinity. Dreadnoughts are going to be your entire backbones of your army. They take a very long time to build, and they drain your resources like mad. So it's not like you're building tiny tanks first, then bigger tanks later, and then all dreadnoughts in the end. No, you'll still be producing a lot of tiny tanks. Maybe a little bit less later on, but you'll still be producing a ton of them. You'll still be producing a large number of middle-range tanks, and siege artillery, and anti-air. Later on, you will have a couple of dreadnoughts mixed in with these armies, and as you progress in the game, this will change a little bit, but not very much. Now, it's important to note that one of the main things in regards to compositions here is that, unlike other games where you build a production facility and later on down the line you expand this production facility with maybe a second building or a third building, and you always build army in a location and you send it over as an army, this game is more about building factories and production facilities all over the map, closer to where you're fighting, so your units have a less distance to travel. And because these units are throwaway, your factories too are throwaway. You can't store these resources, so by default, unless you are restoring your buffer, your storage for resources, they're getting lost anyway. You might as well build a factory out of them. You might as well build a couple of units and just throw them at the enemy. It's very important and vital to the gameplay. It means that forward-facing factories will replenish your army's forward entities faster, and that means you can fight the enemy more efficiently. Okay, I think I've spoken about combat from start to finish in great detail now, and I hope you have a clear image of how the game and combat will be like. What I haven't done yet is giving you my opinions on all of this. I love the combat and gameplay of Ashes of Singularity. It is absolutely phenomenal. It feels great. The big armies, the tactical thinking, the strategic placement, the pre-planning of spending resources instead of just collecting and burning resources, knowing when to build static defense, knowing when to expand your logistics supply, knowing when to expand your unit damage with upgrades. All of these things combined make for a very amazing high-level RTS experience. And one I have not had since Supreme Commander, which was my drug of choice for quite a while, so I love it. But there are some issues I need to address. One of the main issues, as I said earlier, is the strange way the game does detection range versus combat range versus movement range. The other one is obviously how the way unit control is limited. And you could call all of these stylistic choices by the developer. But there's a much bigger one that I feel is sort of annoying because it limits tactics quite a bit. And that is the immobility of your starting nexus. One of the defining characteristics of Supreme Commander and Total Annihilation is that you were never bound to a specific starting location. You could build armies, factories, and move your primary node of command anywhere on the map. You were not restricted to a starting position. This is even true for StarCraft, where you can build a command structure, a hive, or a nexus anywhere and continue playing with how it is. You can build bases and you can build and expand on those bases, and your production facilities can be built on those bases and even rebuilt on different bases. Here, because the game is all about capturing these nodes and capturing these points, you are very limited in where you can actually go. You know you have to heavily defend your main nexus, and you will be building a ton of static defense for that very purpose. You know this, your enemy knows this. So your enemy knows it's going to store up orbital bombardments to break that Yeah, so you know the army is gonna have orbital bombardment, so you build a anti-orbital bombardment building. You know your enemy is going to try with artillery to get out of range, so you build anti-artillery guns. I mean, you already know what your enemy is going to have to try because there's only a set number of things they can do. So what that means is that most of the time the game is going to evolve in a combat of iteration. And this is where also their main issue came in. This is where I think they introduced this Tyrannium mechanic, because it allows them to put a time clock on how long the match will last. A very even match obviously will not have a winner, but neither will not have a clear winner in Tyrannium, so the game continues. But a match where you just can't break through the heavy defense of your opponent and it's a matter of time before you win, they've introduced Tyrannium. So I think their solution to this problem is very elegant, but the problem they have at the bottom line is because the main nexus, your main point of win or loss, is such a tightly locked location where your enemy knows where it is, because starting positions are known, even if the exact position on the multiplayer map is not known. This means that you will end up having to do a very linear type of defense in regards to your nexus, and your enemy knows that he's going to have to do a very linear type of offense based on all the possible defensive structures you might have. And between the two races, these are more or less identical. As I said earlier, they don't really change that much. Okay, that's it. That is Ashes of a Singularity in a nutshell. It is a very, very well built RTS with some performance issues. It has a very nice unit composition where all units are viable, but the number of units is somewhat limited. It has two very fleshed out races that on a base level play the same because the game's mechanics are such as that. And on the higher scale of tactics and game modes and maps, etc., it has a very wide variety of maps, it has a very wide variety of interesting tactics you can perform, and the modding community will probably introduce us a ton of things we can add to the game down the line. I love this game. I have been playing it a ton once I got my hands on it, and I recommend it wholeheartedly, but it's not without its flaws. Like any RTS, it requires a ton of time to learn units. Like any RTS, it requires you to know basically everything there is to know about the game. Regardless of whether or not you might plan on using that unit, you need to know how well a anti-air fighter is going to face another anti-air fighter, and you need to know how well your tankers are going to face enemy artillery, and you need to know how to build this specific unit and how it composes compared to that specific unit. It's a problem inherent on RTSs. One of the main reasons why RTS games have not exactly been the sales successes of days old. None of that takes away that if you like RTSs and you may be a little bit tired of StarCraft 2 and nothing else on the market that is worth your time or effort because it either doesn't have a player base or it has fundamental problems in regards to its gameplay, then Ashes of Singularity might be your kind of cake. It is phenomenal. I am really enjoying my time with it. If you have a computer that can run this, and if you are even remotely interested in RTS games, this game is an absolute blast to play. It is great fun against the AI. It is intense and interesting and fun versus players. And it is a ton of fun with friends over a custom game. Phenomenal. So, Ashes of Singularity out on Steam now. There's a couple of updates coming up. They have a roadmap, but we never know how much that is going to change. But the game that is currently out is already a ton of fun, and it is a great, great game. They've done a lot of work on it over the course of early access, and it is definitely worth a look at, in my opinion. You can check it out on Steam. There's a link in the description below for exactly that. And thank you for watching this video. If you liked this video, press that like button. If you didn't like this video, well, there's a dislike button for exactly that reason. And if you want to see more content like this on the channel, then press that subscribe button and we will deliver. And until then, I wish you a good day, and until next time, right here on Guy Logic.